Roots of the Glaston thorn. Dead is the king that never was born. Dead is the king that never shall die.
A few years ago, I had the privilege of visiting Glastonbury, England. There stand the ruins of what was once one of the most beautiful churches in England, if not the world, larger and lovelier than Canterbury Cathedral or Westminster Abbey. The Glastonbury Church and its adjacent monastery were savagely destroyed, its monks brutally executed by Henry VIII's men because the abbot would not submit to the king's takeover of the English churches. The land was taken from the church and given to an aristocrat who built a mansion for himself using the stones from the cathedral with a nice view of the ruins from his front windows. Glastonbury is the ancient seat of Christianity in England, going back farther than anyone can remember. In fact, there's a legend that Joseph of Arimathea visited Glastonbury. One of the pieces of evidence is the Glastonbury thorn, a tree native only to the Holy Land, but it grows in Glastonbury. And there are other people and events connected with this place whose stories are both shrouded and illuminated in the mists and the lights of legend. The most well-known is also the most tantalizingly unknown, the once and future king, who is part of England's memory even though he eluded the pages of its history, King Arthur. Glastonbury is the legendary site of Avalon. It's also the site of the grave of King Arthur. But like another famous grave in history, it's empty. One of the people who was involved in finding the famous empty grave in Glastonbury was a scholar by the name of Geoffrey Ashe. He's the world's foremost authority on King Arthur. Here I am, by the way, at Glastonbury, and with me are Geoffrey Ashe and his wife Patricia, who is from Alabama, of all places, and you might also recognize my son Julian and my daughter Ashley. Geoffrey Ashe painstakingly followed all the little historical clues that led to the discovery of the real King Arthur. Why did he believe that there was a real King Arthur when so many historians had assured us that he was a mere legend? Because Geoffrey Ashe read G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton writes convincingly of the importance of legend and even the reliability of legend in the absence of written records. But why is King Arthur so important? We're going to try to explain that right now. The first thing we have to try to understand is what Chesterton calls that unlettered interlude in history that is known as the Dark Ages. Most people are in dark about the Dark Ages, and there's some justification for that. It's a period in history of which we know very little. But many people have it confused with another period in history about which we know a great deal. They have the Dark Ages mixed up with the Middle Ages, which were anything but dark. The Dark Ages came before the Middle Ages. It's that period from roughly the 5th century and the fall of the Roman Empire to the 9th century and the rise of medieval Europe. During this time, there was very little written history, which is one of the reasons it's known as the Dark Ages. But the other reason is that the civilized world had largely fallen apart, conquered by barbarian tribes who behaved, quite frankly, like barbarians. They took whatever they wanted, they did whatever they liked, and they did away with whatever they didn't like. There was only one remnant of Roman civilization that remained to oppose the barbarians: the Roman Catholic Church. When Chesterton was in the midst of discovering the Christian faith, he had to deal with one of the common accusations against the Church, namely that Christianity belongs to the Dark Ages, that it arose in a time of ignorance, and that the Church would bring us back to that time if it could. But when he examined the actual historical facts rather than the suggestive modern generalizations, he found that the truth was precisely the other way around.
Christianity, so far from belonging to the Dark Ages, was the one path across the Dark Ages that was not dark. It was a shining bridge connecting two shining civilizations. If anyone says that the faith arose in ignorance and savagery, the answer is really quite simple. It didn't. It arose in the Mediterranean civilization in the full summer of the Roman Empire. The world was swarming then with skeptics. Pantheism was as plain as the sun when Constantine nailed the cross to the mast. Then, after being buried under the debris of dynasties and clans, we arose and remembered Rome. If our faith had been a mere fad of that fading empire, fad would have followed fad in the twilight, and if the civilization ever re-emerged, it would have been under some new barbaric flag. But the Christian church was the last life of the old society, and was also the first life of the new. She took the people who were forgetting how to make an arch, and she taught them to invent the Gothic Arch. In a word, the most absurd thing that could be said of the church is the thing we have all heard said of it. How can we say that the church wishes to bring us back into the Dark Ages? After all, the church was the only thing that ever brought us out of them.
At the beginning of the Dark Ages, Rome was a slave state, with a huge portion of the population indentured to a small, wealthy ruling class. By the Middle Ages, slavery had disappeared. There was a large majority of free, self-sufficient peasants. At the beginning of the Dark Ages, there were no universities, no hospitals, no beautiful cathedrals. By the Middle Ages, all of these things had been developed, and most of those beautiful cathedrals still stand. As Chesterton says, it was the church that brought us out of the Dark Ages and brought about the return of civilization. We do not want to bring back the Dark Ages, but the Dark Ages have returned in spite of our efforts. Ask yourself, is our civilization improving or is it declining? For the last 2 centuries or so, that period that we call the modern world, the loudest thinkers have told us that we are improving, even rapidly improving. And this was in part because of the rise of industrialism and the impressive advances in technology and medicine and communication. How can we argue against that? Well, we can. We can start by admitting that the Industrial Revolution also brought with it great social blight and human oppression. That technology not only has given us bigger machines, but also bigger war machines and bigger wars. And even medicine, while giving us complex ways to preserve life, has also given us sophisticated ways to end life. That improved communications have allowed us to rapidly transmit a lot of rubbish, including obscenity and pornography, that's now completely out of control. And there are now all forms of electronic addiction, what you might call e-slavery, as we're handcuffed to laptops and cell phones and handhelds. We don't hear the counter-arguments because we assume that everything's getting better. We have unconsciously embraced the modern philosophy called progressivism, but its other name is Darwinism. G.K. Chesterton is one of the few truly prophetic thinkers who has said that our civilization is actually in decline, that the barbarians are the ones who are advancing.
I used to think that the chief modern danger was a danger of over-civilization. Now I am inclined to think that the chief modern danger is that of a slow return towards barbarism. Civilization in the best sense merely means the full authority of the human spirit over all externals. Barbarism, on the other hand, means the worship of those externals in their crude and unconquered state. Barbarism means the worship of nature. And in recent poetry, science, and philosophy, there has been too much of this worship of nature. Whenever men begin to talk much and with great solemnity about the forces outside man, the note of it is invariably barbaric. When men talk much about heredity and environment, they are almost barbarians. The modern men of science are many of them almost barbarians. That is why they remain squalid and unhappy, always talking about heredity, always talking about environment. Savages, those that are truly stunted or depraved, dedicate nearly all their tales and sayings to the subject of physical kinship, or the curse of this or that tribe, of a taint in this or that family, of the invincible law of blood, of the unavoidable evil of places. The true savage, you see, is a slave, and is always talking about what he must do. The true civilized man, on the other hand, is a free man, and he is always talking about what he may do.
In other words, civilization is based on the dignity of man. And the dignity of man is based on the principle of free will. The basis of barbarism is determinism, that our fate is in the stars, or in the earth, or in our blood, but in something we cannot control. Blaming our behavior on our parentage, or on our poverty, or on our wealth, or on our weather is more evidence that we are moving into the new dark ages, that barbarism is growing. We keep looking for excuses to do whatever we want. We don't live in a truth-seeking age. We live in a pleasure-seeking age. But as Chesterton says, the very fury with which people go on seeking pleasure is a proof that they have not found it.
The problem with some modern writers is not that they attack all that is bad in civilization, but that they admire all that is bad in barbarism.
Chesterton is not surprised to see the artists and the sophisticates and the educated elite drawing nearer and nearer to savagery. They are purposely rebelling against civilization, not against its corruptions, but against its institutions, against marriage and courtesy and a code of justice. They follow the fatalistic tendencies of the savage and his temptations to be terrorized by the monstrous and the merely obscure. They are unhappy. They are restless. They are hostile. They are agnostic. In other words, they live in darkness. And yet they accuse the church of wanting to bring us back to the Dark Ages. Chesterton says it is the decisive people who are civilized. It is the indecisive, otherwise called the higher skeptics, or the idealistic doubters, who have remained barbarians. Even though they are unhappy and do not have a creed, there is still one thing they manage to believe in: youth and its beautiful energy. But Chesterton points out that this is also a sign of decadence.